Hello and welcome back to the Lighthouse. We are well underway with another terrific day in the YSI plenary. Already 4 different speakers gave us great input into our questions today, and we've traveled from constellation to constellation. Next up, we are headed over to the role of Economist's constellation, where Jakob Kapeller will give us input into our exercise. Remember that the point is for YSI to figure out 100 pertinent research questions that can feed into our work and inspire us in their time to come. If you're new to this process, here's a little video that explains to you exactly how that works. First, go to ysiplenary.org and click the night sky. This is the question sphere, where each star is a question, and each group of stars, or constellation, contains questions within a particular topic. You can find question sphere sessions in the schedule in the left sidebar and join them from there. Just enter the session and join the Zoom. As you listen to the speaker motivate their questions, think about which questions you believe to be pertinent for YSI. While the speaker talks, suggest your questions to your peers by entering them into the panel. This is not a Q&A. The questions are suggestions for research in YSI, not a question for the speaker to answer. Take a look at all the questions that were suggested and like the ones that you think are best. The questions moderator will select the most liked questions and present them to the speaker for a comment. These questions will be added to the constellation, where they can be further refined. Refine the questions by finding the best exact phrasing. Suggest a rephrasing yourself, or like the rephrasings that you think are good. After the session is over, you can find the submitted questions in the constellations. As a plenary participant, you can mark your 10 favorite questions in the graph. Just click the star in the corner of the questions card, and they will be added to your YSI profile. The most popular questions will make it into the final list. With that introduction, I think you are ready to go over to the constellation of the role of economists. Let's head to Thomas Voss.
Let me ask you this. What is an economist? An abstract observer of markets and process, charting their disasters and prosperous progress? Are they just math nerds or august philosophers? It may not be obvious, even if you're an economist, just what the object of being an economist is, starting with this. Are you neutral observers, or are you in the business of customer service? And if you are, is the customer the public or persons with personal wealth with the strings to the purses? Is it a natural science of observable facts, or a social science that creates and refracts within the cultural prism? Do its promises and pacts represent the general welfare or political facts? That's the question, and as it gets renewed, there's no one who can give it a good answer until we do it. Even if we don't yet all agree on what they're doing, at least we can agree, economists are human.
Hey everyone, hi. We are over in the role of economist constellation now. So if you're browsing around the site, come over here to the Zoom call. People are already starting to check in. And I'm Thomas Voss. I'm a member of the YSI management team, but for now, I'm going to be the question moderator for this session with Jakob Kapeller. As Heske just explained, and you saw in the video, while Jakob is talking, we will be quiet on this call, but then we can still suggest questions. The idea is that we're going to be thinking about research questions for YSI going forward, and we're going to use Jakob's talk to give us inspiration, good ideas for what those questions could be, so that maybe we can get them on that list of 100 questions we're going to have at the end of the plenary. If you log into the site and come onto the role of economist constellation, into the session, you'll see a yellow button that says suggest new question. That's where you should suggest a question. If you like the question suggested by others, you can give them a heart, and then we'll make sure that the most liked question gets to Jakob so he can comment on them. And afterwards, we're going to be back here, and then we can discuss and rephrase and end up with a really good list of questions to submit to the constellation at the end. But for now, come into the Zoom call, and I'm going to hand it off to Merve, who will introduce Jakob.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Merve Burnazoğlu. I'm one of the coordinators of the Philosophy and Economics Working Group. And it's a great pleasure to moderate this session with our speaker, Jakob Kapeller. Jakob is a professor at the Institute for Socioeconomics at the University of Duisburg-Essen, and he is also the head of the Institute for Comprehensive Analysis of the Economy at Johannes Kepler University Linz. Jakob is first trained as a philosopher who then found himself, let's say, too fascinated by socioeconomic issues, and which then led him to earn his PhD in social and economic sciences in 2011 from Johannes Kepler University Linz. His research mostly focuses on socioeconomic change from a political economy perspective, distributional issues, the history of economic and political ideas, and the philosophy of social sciences, and last but not least, heterodox economics and pluralism. He is a very active scholar and a prominent advocate of plural and heterodox economics. He has been serving as the editor of the Heterodox Economics newsletter since 2013, which, as many of you may know, is a great source for heterodox events, publications, and announcements. So, Jakob, thank you very much for joining us in finding the most inspiring economic questions of our time. And we are very happy and excited to have you here and hear about your questions. So, thank you. Please, the floor is yours.
Many thanks for the nice introduction, and many thanks for having me today. My talk is simply titled 3 Questions, because, you know, the most inspiring questions, that's a big aim. I try to leave it at 3 questions that hopefully make sense. So now hopefully this clicker works. Let's see. Yeah, perfect. The first question, so to say, I submitted when I was requested to do so, was the following. Efficiency serves as the main target dimension in economics. How should we broaden the normative lens in economic analysis? And what I will always do is I do not have the answers to these questions, okay? I do not have the perfect answers to these questions, which is why I think they are somehow pressing or interesting. But of course, I have some associations and hunches and maybe possible first steps, and it's basically always these associations that I will share with you in what follows. So the first thing I want to show is what I always show my students. So we have a master degree in socioeconomics at University Duisburg-Essen. The question always arises: what, so to say, is characteristic of socioeconomic analysis? And I think one thing that is that socioeconomic analysis would incorporate a broad set of what I would call target dimensions like the one listed here. So I've allocated some target dimensions more to the social part of socioeconomics and others more to the economic part. And you see here, for example, on the social part, we have ideas like well-being, like cohesion, trust, identity, like resilience. Yeah, let me point out, this was written before the Corona crisis. I already had it there before it came obvious. And on the economic side, I have stuff like knowledge, nature, of course, as a prime source for any economic activity. And this a category that's called performance work output. And then I have also some possible target dimensions that I locate in between, which are mostly about conflict, power, status, hierarchies, and so. And I think this is important because the target dimensions, be they analytically or be they practically or politically, we have in mind when starting our thoughts, when starting our, so to say, analytical endeavors. These target dimensions have an imprint on the questions and problems we study. And okay, in some cases, maybe these target dimensions have a stronger normative imprint, and in other cases they're really more maybe framed positively, but still reflecting on this important question: which target dimensions, which aims, which values do coin our research questions, and do we have enough variety in this regard is crucial, I would say. And the thing here is that current standard economics in, so to say, charted into my graph would be somewhere here in the right bottom corner, where we have efficiency as the main focus of the standard approach. And it's, in my view, not wrong to look at efficiency, but we have to keep in mind that efficiency, this focus of efficiency always drastically, in many cases, reduces the complexity of the problem and subject that we basically study. So a plurality of target dimension can be understood as an antidote to, so to say, overlooking the complexity inherent in the problems we're interested in. And this is also the major message of this quote by Hirschman that I wanted to share with you, where, so to say, the principal enemy is orthodoxy because it leads us to overlook or ignore complexity. Another thing I wanted to point out that I think is important is that we have to put more work into identifying and contextualizing normative assumptions in economic thought, especially in the dominant version of it in mainstream economics, neoclassical economics. Okay, here's a recent example taken from a Nobel Prize speech where it basically says that we have a finding which says that the optimal degree of global warming is somehow +3 degrees of Celsius. And Nordhaus in this quotation admits that this is a controversial finding, and so, but still we have to ask. What are the assumptions we have to make to arrive at such an outcome, and it's obvious if you look into these models that the assumptions on the discounting factors on how to discount future states is crucial. And what economists have done here is they've said, hey, humans are generally impatient, and so human impatience is a good guide to assessing social welfare. And this is wrong for two reasons. It's on the one hand a naturalistic fallacy to say it is the case, so this should be a good target. And the other fallacy is also that it's not interdisciplinary robust. No, if we would talk to, for example, a biologist, they would put survival first and not discount future states that radically. So I think this is just an example for what you could do, but I think much more time could be spent on dissecting these normative aspects in conventional economic thought. And I have simply screenshotted two books here that I personally found worthwhile and inspirational and a help for reflecting on these issues, and especially the left one. It's by Christine Schrader-Frechette, the Philosopher of Science, and in her book she really, so to say, engages with pressing issues that are quite close to what I've said before. So, for example, here's a quotation where she basically juxtaposes the radical economist's view of a cost-benefit state, as she calls it here, where we basically say that every regulation, every public infrastructure we erect has to pass a cost-benefit test. Okay, and her argument is simply in this quotation, it's simply pointing out that such a kind of radical consequentialism can be quite brutal in ethical terms, because we think that when we look at her examples below, that for example, go in a virtue ethic sense, but even that, so to say, in a radical view, can be subjected to this kind of consequentialist intuition that's behind this kind of cost-benefit calculation. And so to say, she raises awareness that in these radical interpretations, there is no place for virtue ethics, even if we look at examples where it would seem quite obvious to say, give a preference to a non-consequentialist approach. Much of the normative power of economics rests on the idea that in economics there exists a strong professional consensus based on expertise and deep insight that eventually intellectually justifies such suggestions like the cost-benefit state I took as an example here. But I wanted to point out in the context of this issue where we talk about normativity that this is actually not so true, okay? So the economists' belief of professional consensus in the discipline and also the policy views coming out of the discipline are driven, so to say, by scientific insight rather than political preference is, I would say, not totally wrong, but it's a vastly overstated case, okay? I give you here a quotation from a typical publication published in the AAR, where we basically say we have, on every question where there has been at least a little bit of research, we have basically full consensus. So economics is really a thing of experts. If you have if different people have this knowledge, they will arrive at the same conclusion. Contrary to that, at our research department in Linz, we looked at economic policy petitions, and we looked for the network of economists undersigning economic policy related petitions in the US. And what we find when we construct the network, this is what you see below, is we find a bipolar network. Okay, there is a Democratic network and there is a Republican network. And as you see in the network structure, these two are distinct from a network perspective, and they also advance very distinct policy views. And if you look, so to say, in the middle where the consensus would be, there are only a few topics like migration or free trade where there is real consensus between these two camps. So basically what we find here is that simple left-right thinking still matters for understanding the political orientation of economists. I'm close to finishing my comments on my first question. I just want to point out that it is sometimes said that efficiency is just a means, never an end. I would argue that efficiency can be interpreted in a way that it's only a means and not an end, but very often this transcends in economics and efficiency becomes an end in itself. And I would say this is the case for, this is visible very good in the case of free trade. What I noted here is basically economic openness and development, so as a placeholder for globalization. And then we find that in this context of asking the question, how does globalization impact development, we have different findings. No, we have core-periphery relations, so a structural division of labor across the globe that is moderating who catches up and who does not catch up. We have regulatory arbitrage and race for the best locations, so a downward pressure on regulation and standards because they're only nationally implemented. We have cumulative causation in technological development. That means past dependency in a key production factor, in the distribution of a key production factor. We have increasing inequality, and of course we have, so to say, these less controversial outcomes like the potential to develop by attracting FDI, or the general finding that possibly free trade might shift the production possibility frontier. Okay, so we have a diversity of outcomes, and I would say if you compare the policy stance now of different economic groups, it's simply explained how this comes to be. So heterodox economists, political economists would focus when discussing the consequences of globalization more on these blue issues, whereas mainstream economists would much more willing to favor free trade because they simply focus on these green items. They focus, they say, on these gains from trade, which basically represent, and this decision to focus on these gains from trade represents the conviction that a greater pie is always better than a more equally distributed pie. And this is a specific understanding of the notion of efficiency we find in standard economics. Okay. Just as a side note here, efficiency as an end in itself is an interesting philosophical topos by itself. It's a major building block of dystopian storylines. So the the earliest dystopian novel I know of, Samyatin's V from 1920, already has this idea of a perfect and efficient society. Same holds for Brave New World, where everything, so to say, is tailored to be efficient, and also for more recent stuff. So if you think of the Borg in Star Trek, they want to assimilate anything and create a huge hive mind, because this is how they strive for achieving perfection by improving efficiency. Okay, so you see that this is on, so to say, on the next meta level of refraction. Efficiency as an end in itself can be something quite dark, actually. Having said that, I come to my second question: how to resolve the political constraint arising from the race for the best location that coins current globalization. So again, I would start with this picture I already showed you, and because I already showed it to you, I can be short on this. My first step in answering this would be to acknowledge that differences in theoretical orientation, in theoretical foci, might affect evaluations. And again, so I would argue that the conjoined perspective of political economists and mainstreamers is, if so to say, weighted in an appropriate way, probably superior to any perspective in isolation. A broader set of evaluations, a broader set of opinions would probably allow also for more nuanced, more sensitive policy decisions. Still, I think that the major theoretical issue, or that there is a major theoretical issue in the background. As you might know, we could speak of two models of globalized market. The first one still follows this Ricardo comparative advantage framework, and the other one, the competing one, is probably Danny Roderick's globalization trilemma, where he says we have basically three aims: free trade, national sovereignty, and democracy. And it's probably only possible practically to achieve 2 out of 3. And so to say, the way I currently see things going, my impression is that we are stuck in this race for the best location, so a competition between nations for employment, for investment, for taxes, and so on. One argument why this race for the best location model, which basically is mentioned on the left side of the slide, is superior to the Ricardo model, is that the Ricardo model makes a series of assumptions that simply do not apply very well to our world. Again, we can sort of say inspect models to ask not only what target dimensions do they have, what normative assumptions do they have built in, but we can also always ask, of course, are they adequate for a given historical situation? And I would argue the Ricardo model is not so much. Yeah, having said that, what to do against the race for the best location? So basically I have 3 suggestions, and I will present them only very shortly. One suggestion is formulated from the perspective of the global south, and I here, for the ease of storytelling, applied to Latin America. And my argument when being invited to discuss this kind of developmental problems is always that we have little alternatives. Okay, typically applied to Latin America, we would say, okay, the history of infant industry protection is mixed, but in the long run, exporting primary goods is not a long-term option, and this is what's currently happening. Yeah? And the one possible solution would be, in my view, to collude and protect. This means to, so to say, collude internally and create stronger economic and political ties inside South and Latin America, but maybe to create stronger borders to the outside. Okay, and this is basically, I would see from a practical point of view, would come with a series of potential advantages, which I list here in the smaller bullet points. Whether these advantages could actually be exploited is, of course, a matter of the actual policies applied, but I think, so to say, one could delineate theoretically some advantages related to a stronger tendency for collusion. And of course, this is not very innovative. This is simply suggesting to replicate, so to say, the best practice model for economic catch-up. This is basically the model how Germany caught up to Great Britain. This motivated economic and political reforms in 19th century Germany. And I would say these kind of trade-related policies in conjunction with the educational policies of the Prussian government really made, so to say, Germany the economic force that it is today. Yeah, I could spend 20 minutes on that point alone, but I will leave it at that and simply, so to say, leave it at this image of collude and protect as a potential alternative to think about policy. Second example I want to make is that second suggestion I want to make in this context is that we have to rethink the governing of resource use. On my slides, I say here that maybe the Norwegian model is an example, because what the Norwegians managed to do, they were always in a privileged position, so to say, in terms of global policy, but still what they managed to do is to turn their wealth of resources into an opportunity, and it did not delve into a trap. And I think that rethinking the governance of resource use is essential, because this is an area, maybe focus on this slide, where we have strong path dependencies. Okay, what you see here is basically how much raw material is exported and imported, and we find, so to say, that exporters successively increase the exports, importing nations and regions successively increase the imports, and we have these strong path dependencies that we always use up more material resources, and this path dependency is only interrupted, so to say, by big economic crisis. So, and let me just add, I mean, from a more philosophical point of view, this idea of rethinking resource use, it has also a big tradition in philosophy. Yeah, just think about Stuart Mill and others, and other Enlightenment-based writers who basically say that natural resources in all their forms are something like a joint property of humankind, and it depends on us to develop institutional solutions that do justice to this general legal insight, so to say. My third suggestion regarding trade patterns, regarding race for the best location, is for the global north. Here, basically, I have just listed again what is race for the best locations. So it's a race between nations that puts a downward pressure on standards and regulations because they are costly. Okay, and I list here a series of evidence in the history of economic thought from experiments or from other social spheres where such a mechanism, more competition, leads to an evasion of rules and regulation is at play. Okay, and the most prominent example in economics currently is probably the issue of tax havens and profit shifting and all that. A potential solution we once devised would be to say that we should create a public agency for product regulation and surveillance to combat this tendency for marginal ethics, as it's called. So if this downward pressure on standards and morals and regulations, sometimes called marginal ethics. And our archetype for constructing this suggestion is the Japanese Top Runner program. And in this Top Runner program, the logic is the following. We assess for some product category the energy efficiency, and the best player in the market is used as a standard, and all products in this sector have to comply with the standard within a phase of 3 years or so. And so they ensure that energy efficiency is really a dimension that actually truly matters in competition between firms. Okay, and so they managed to shift the innovation trajectory. Employing that to the European case and expanding it, so to say, from electronic products to all products, and from energy efficiency to a more diverse set of aims. Our suggestion in the publications we had a few years ago was to create the European Agency for Commodity Surveillance that, so to say, mimics the operating principle of the Top Runner program, enforcing dynamic standards with respect to product quality, labor quality, and so on. And again, we would have, as you see here in the description of how the agency works, this dynamic approach where we, so to say, impose higher and higher standards over time. So, after having collected some associations to the problem of international competition and the race for the best locations, this is actually my third question, not suggestion 3. And the third question I asked was how to save the climate without causing further distributional asymmetries and restricting individual freedom. Here I'm probably not that well prepared as with the other questions, but still I have worked on this in the past month actually, because I think it's important. And my very, very, very preliminary third answer was to look at, to compare the financial plans of the European Commission, how big shall the European Green New Deal be, with the financial requirements to make Europe carbon neutral. And the short summary of this paper was, not so much to my surprise, that the Green Deal won't live up to the job, which is why we looked at how much could a European wealth tax bring in to, so to say, bring in additional financial firepower to these tasks. And this is basically what you see in the table on the right are our preliminary estimates copied out of recent work we're doing on how much such a tax could probably levy. Finally, I think when rethinking this issue of how to reduce our carbon output, or more generally how to decrease our resource use, it might be of help to step away from GDP monotheism and make use of broader measures of welfare. Okay, and I think there are a lot of suggestions for such broader measures, but I think still much work is to be done to bring that on the one hand into the political practice, but also much work has to be done comparing these indicators and to try to get a good synthesis out of the literature. I like just to reference one paper by Jones, and I have two graphs of Jones. Jones basically compares GDP and a welfare measure, and in his welfare measure he is very conservative, so it's an AER paper. He only adds 3 variables, namely leisure, life expectancy, and inequality. So his welfare measure is basically an index composed out of these 4 categories, and he plots that against income. Yeah? And on the one hand, you could say, wow, we see this very high correlation between welfare and income. So does it really make a difference? But if we look at the lower graph, at the picture at the bottom, we see that when we normalize, so to say, the amount of well-being we get for $1, we normalize it by taking the US case as the $1 case. We see that basically for $1 income, we get more life satisfaction in the European countries that have strong public infrastructure, strong social security systems, and we get typically less life satisfaction in those countries where, so to say, we have much worse infrastructure. So still, even this very conservative approach gives us a clear insight that many things that we do not measure adequately when using GDP as a measure for well-being and welfare will pop up, even if we only slightly modify the categories we use for assessing social welfare. So, yeah, many thanks for your attention. I hope you found something interesting and inspiring. And for me, it was a pleasure to sort of say engage in this maybe not very rigorous, but really nice and spontaneous interaction on these questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Jakob, for these 3 great questions and your very insightful reflections and examples relating to them. And I must say, I particularly appreciate that you remind us that efficiency is just a means, not an end in itself. I guess we need to get reminded about it more often. And I also appreciate your call, going beyond efficiency and bringing like other dimensions, if I may say, back into economics, even though they will bring complexity into our disciplines. And I fully agree with you in your emphasis on the necessity of identifying and contextualizing the critical normative assumptions in economic theory. And lastly, you also brought on the table a question that I think requires an immense attention. That is not only how to save the climate, but how to do it without causing even more distributional asymmetries than we have, and also without restricting the individual freedoms. So I believe these are all great questions, and I look forward to seeing how YSI people will engage these questions in the future. And now we have received few questions from the young scholars audience during your talk, and we would like to get your reflections on them. So again, we don't necessarily ask you to give an answer, provide us with some answers, but reflect upon them and also maybe comment how relevant they are, you think, for future research projects. So let's see the question one. So the question one is, do economists need to have a shared conception of the ultimate ends of economics?
Can you read me? Okay. Confusing a little bit to see myself. I think the clear answer to this question is no, actually not. My recommendation would be to have a broad understanding, and within this broad understanding, we can also have these very important conversations on which target dimensions really matter, and we do not have or are the most important or something like that. And we do not have to find a definite agreement on that, but my recommendation would be to have a broad set of concepts available to draw on and to make comparisons, and also to ask the important question. So these reflexive questions: are we still on the right path? Do we still, so to say, have an appropriate focus for guiding our research? So this would be my answer. There doesn't have to be consensus on this, as long as we have some variety. Yeah, and you can play that through with the example of resilience. So when I was a student, an economics student, I sometimes, so to say, mentioned this motive of resilience in my lectures, and my teachers would look at me like if I was an alien, because simply this was something unknown, and it also sounded a little heretic, and so you could back it up with biology, but still, yeah. And today this would be quite different. So if economists would have had a good concept of resilience before the corona crisis, maybe they could now make more substantial contributions.
Okay, thank you very much. And I would like to move on to the second question we received from the audience and ask your reflections on that. So the question is, what should and shouldn't be included when we speak of the economy?
Mm-hmm. This is a very broad question. And in the economy, ontologically, in the more narrow sense, I would still tend to traditional definitions and say the economy, so to say, includes a public sector, and includes firms, and includes households, and includes lots of interactions and circular flows between them. Connections play a big role within this economy, not only in the form of circular flows, but also contracts and trusts and so on. And this is the economy in the more narrow sense, but I would always emphasize that you risk you have the risk of omission if you do not also acknowledge for the fact that the economic activities and processes in the more narrow sense, and also more narrowly defined economic actors like firms or so, exist in a social context. So basically we can make a narrow definition of the economy, but simply not abstract from the fact that it is embedded in a greater context, and it's hardly, so to say, conceivable or fully understandable without taking this context into account. No, you can have a perfect theory of your liver, but still should be reminded that the liver is a part of your body, and so to say, not forgetting the context does not preclude having narrow and clear definitions on the more narrow subject, I would say.
Okay. Thank you very much for this as well. And
sorry, maybe one additional thing. When we speak of embedding and we want to do it correctly, and I did not do it correctly now, we also we always have to think of it in a double way, namely embedding in society, so culture and stuff like that, but also embedding in nature, of course, no, because this is always also something we treat as external, and we want to be sensitive for the stuff that's overlooked. Yeah, I should add that.
Well, I think you have time for that, because I see that the third question we have from the audience is can be used for that as well, I think. So the third question we have is, what could be the core idea of economics in the 21st century that is beyond the allocation of scarce resources?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in my view, maybe this is very old-fashioned and not innovative at all, but my core idea of economics is to study economics as a social provisioning process. So I would tend to the definition that we, so to say, typically would use in political economy or in heterodox economics. So economics is the study of the social provisioning process, and I think, so to say, this is a sufficient framing for understanding the core purpose and also the most important questions of the subject. And I think when framing it this way, it also becomes clear that that, so to say, satisficing like routines and properties are maybe more important than maximizing routines and properties. So there's maybe, with respect to this reference to the allocation of scarce resources specifically said, maybe one specific implications of this focus on provisioning would be to look more onto the question what satisfies us, maybe also to differentiate between different kinds of needs and wants, and look less on the question what is efficient, optimal, and so to say the outcome of a suitable maximization process. I think this is maybe something that's attached to it that also relates to the question.
Okay, and we have a great question, I must say, a broad question again. That is, what is the purpose of economics?
Honestly spoken, I mean, economics is a science. So the purpose of economics for me is to understand a little better why the things that are going on. And for me, this is, so to say, I'm a purist, yeah, I admit it. The first purpose. So science is for me is an endeavor that, so to say, is its own end. And it does not have to fulfill any pragmatic purpose. Of course, in an ideal world, probably economics could contribute to finding better forms of political and social organization. But I think in the current way we have it, and in the current state of the discipline, its impact is ambivalent to detrimental. So if we had a better, more open more pluralist, broader, more inclusive economics, probably one could also say economics has a good purpose in informing the practical decisions and applied decisions and policy decisions, and I'm not against that. But for me, really the first task is to get a grip on at least understanding the economic history we have and get a rough idea of the basic structure of the problems we have contemporarily and the mechanisms that are relevant. So call me a dentist in the spirit of Keynes, you know, this quote where he says we have to be somehow modest like dentists, and I would concur. So the purpose of economics is to do modest analysis and point to the many things we do not really know for sure.
Okay, thank you very much, Jakob. Do you have any question to add to the graph, maybe? Would you suggest any new question?
Not at the moment. So I'm totally satisfied with my 3. And I will check out whether they will be voted up or down at the end. So if you vote me down, I won't take part next time.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much again for joining us, Jakob, today, and bringing in your insights, questions, reflections, everything. That was great. So with that, the first part of the session is now over, but the second part is about to begin. So first, back to the studio.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Merve, and thank you, Jakob. And thanks to all of you for suggesting great questions for this constellation. If you're in the Zoom with Thomas Vaas, now is your time to refine these questions and figure out together which ones you want to be adding to the constellation. If you're watching on the broadcast, you can also choose to stay there and switch over with us to Shannon Monat, who will take us through in the globalization constellation for our next session. So take your pick and enjoy the rest of the day.